Guten Morgen, good morning, Talofa lover. This is Dr. Snow Brown speaking to you all, especially to my Snow Cane Club congregation, my Knights and Chiefs of the 150 Days War Program. Today being a very special day, it's a significant symbolic day for me personally, being the 10th of March 2022. Now, following up from the last video I just posted, this is very serious actually. What I'm about to say to the rest of, not just to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and her Royal Monarch, but also to the government of New Zealand, and also to His Royal Highness Tuheitea Pōtautau Te Wherewhero the 7th, and his Royal Monarch here in New Zealand. In fact, this is very important because it will affect the future of all monarchs, especially one being the English monarch, one being the Maori monarch, and of course my monarch won't be affected. But the two monarchs that have just announced, is correct, will be affected. That's correct. Now, as you all know, there is a war at the moment that will amount to a third war that will probably spill over to be World War III. They all know that. Yes, President Vladimir Putin, the Russian, that's correct, war is seen to be, well, it's already taken place in Ukraine. But it is likely to spread, it is likely to cross Romania or Poland, those borders, those countries, which are NATO countries, and everyone knows that. Now, as you would have read in my posting, that's correct. Remember, there's the guardian angel and the archangel, that's correct, and also my queen, who speaks through me. That's correct. And through our Lord's Holy Spirit. And that is United Kingdom, Great Britain, is now what? Is now under fire, but is now guilty. Guilty of treasons against this noble here that is speaking to you all this morning. That's correct. And that is, this noble is Dr. Snow Brown. Now, you'd all like to you all like to brainwash yourselves and even manipulate your minds in thinking that I couldn't be a noble. Unfortunately, if you have to check my background, check my bloodline, and check also my heritage and lineage, you will see, and check my DNA, you will find somewhere among that DNA analysis, there will be the Scottish and English heritage right there. That will probably trace back to the nobles, to the English nobles, and looks like the Queen of Scotland, that's correct. Joan Beaufort, that's correct. And also the Stuart family. Now, the Treviranus family were part royals, that's correct. Now, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had known that knowledge long time ago, and my rallies knows very well my heritage, and which side I descended from, or where the royalty descended from, that's correct. Now, the problem is they're all jealous, and they've always been jealous of me. Over the years, that's correct, because they had known that one day, I being the eldest of 7 children, will one day become a noble. Just like my mother's dad, that's correct. Ututunatia Batu, he was a noble. That's correct. And it's because he was full royal, that's right. And they had a private monarch in the islands, in Samoa. Like a lot of the so-called nobles in Samoa, now, the former Prime Minister of Samoa, that's correct, Tulepa, right, he's a noble. And also the current Samoa Prime Minister, Mataafa, that's correct, is also, Fiame, a noble, except they're of a different type of noble. That's correct. I am very similar to the noble of Queen Victoria. That's correct. Or most nobles in Germany. Except my nobleness is so unique. Because my throne is in heaven. That's correct. Sits above all your thrones or any other thrones here on earth, any other kingdoms here on earth. So my throne and my crown is above Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Now, sometime this morning, or later last night, around about past midnight, I received, revelations, or I received directions and delegations from my Queen, Her Majesty Queen Snow Brown, that's correct, through the guardian angel, Samalama, and Archangel Warren, through the Holy Spirit, and also that was to reverse the treaty partnership, reverse the treaty document, that's correct. So, and that was because it was to satisfy, but it was also a sacrifice on behalf of New Zealand, on behalf of all the injustices and the so-called treasons committed against my private meek monarch, that's correct, and my nobleness against my royal family, that's correct. So the treaty document had to be sacrificed. Your treaty document was offered up, was given up as an offering on the Holy Altar, on the Crystal Kingdom Church TV Holy Altar. And the agreement was between myself and my Lord and my Queen, and even with Queen Victoria, Her Majesty Queen Victoria, and also the Maori nobles that passed away, was that all their blessings that were part of that document were to be forfeited, and transferred and bestowed upon myself and my meek monarch, were to be given to the brown monarch. That's correct. And I was to take those blessings, meaning the treaty document was not only reversed, but any blessings that were part of the treaty that came from Her Majesty Queen Victoria and from the Maori nobles, but came from Queen Victoria, that sealed the document, and even the indigenous, all the Maori people's so-called blessings that came with that document over the last 180 years, they have now been transferred and forfeited and given and passed on and relinquished and given to myself and my private monarch, and for my round tables and for my knights and chiefs, and especially for my congregation. That's correct. And that was because, like I said, it was also to appease the deceased, and they were justified in saying, no, sorry, but we do not want any, nobody in this country is worthy enough to receive our blessings. And they seem to have squandered their gifts, squandered our blessings, that's correct, and misused and abused them. But they've used it also. They've misused the document to commit treasons against your family, royal family, and also to harm your royal family. And that was never the intention of the treaty partnership from the outset, from the very beginning. And Your Majesty Queen Victoria has blessed this noble here, and has passed on from her, that's correct, her blessing that were part of the treaty document to come to me, that's correct, to come to myself. Now I, of course, you will not believe this, that's correct. But the other sacrifice that had to be done, that was part of that arrangement also, with this agreement, this covenant, this is now a covenant, an agreement between the gods, that's correct, and the deceased. Those were their wishes, in order for them to rest in peace and to smile, that's correct, and to enter a kingdom. I needed to do that on their behalf. Just like a lawyer, I'm acting on behalf, but I'm a sovereign head. Now, whose sovereign head am I part of? Well, my kingdom was born in your country, in New Zealand, that's correct. brackets Aotearoa. In 2006, around about November. That's correct, in the form of a play that was written. But you see, in the form of also a holy shrine, my very first holy shrine, and the application of my rules during that time. But the horrible thing about you English, that's correct, and I'm talking about these are Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's supporters. These are actually supporters of her monarch and her sovereign head. Don't forget, that's correct. And part of the so-called the Maori, the treaty partnership as well. They actually gave you a second lot of unexplained nosebleed, which was quite severe. Another lot of tortures, another lot of tortures. 2006, when they entered my address unlawfully, like in home invasion, and stole my play off my so-called computer. That's correct. And of course, obviously, they didn't like what they read and decided to give you a torture, that's correct, on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, that's correct. Because after all, this country serves the interest of Her Majesty, that's correct. Now, as far as I'm concerned, of course, they would have only have been police officers in uniform. That's correct. They would have entered your address around about the 15th of November 2006, because that's when the nosebleed started. And it didn't stop till around about the 30th of November 2006. But the third one happened here at this address, that's correct, which was even severe. But that second one was far more severe because I ended up in hospital. That's correct. Where I remember also that there were some strange pains, like definitely very similar pains that I have felt here in 2018 towards nearing the same time when I was doing my program, all those rules, that's correct. So you can see now why England is guilty, why Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is guilty, her sovereign head, of committing treasons against this meek monarch, this meek royal, that's correct. And I'm talking about her people are guilty. That the English, that's right, in this country. That includes my rallies as well, who are yellow mellow marshmallows, that's correct. This is really, really serious. Yeah, it is serious. So what is the other blessing what is the other sacrifice that was made on my holy altar? Well, officially, I offered up Queen Elizabeth II's crown and throne. That's correct. And that the English monarch would revert back, convert to a commoner's normal royal family, minus a throne and minus a crown. So what that means is that Queen Elizabeth II has just lost her blessing, that's correct, that she had been enjoying all these years as a queen. The crown that the crown that she's been wearing for the last over 60 years, that's correct, of her reignship and rulership, that has been taken away. That's correct. It has been forfeited. So that means that Prince William will not ascend to a throne and will not be crowned as the new King of England. So that blessing has been taken away and forfeited by the gods. That's correct. And it was only because, it was because they committed treasons, that's correct, against your private meek monarch. You see, there is a convention among nobles and among royals, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II knows very well that if anything, if a crown, yes, right, if a sovereign head commits serious treasons against any other sort of related connections, that's correct, meaning a Scottish sovereign head, they would lose their throne and their crown. Now, it always has been convention that back in the days, you were executed, you were executed if you committed treason. That's correct. But under the circumstances, in this new monarch, maybe this is a baby monarch, that's correct, but this is a true royal blood, that's correct, of royalty. Instead of being executed, you won't ascend to a throne, and you won't be wearing a crown. No one in English monarch will be crowned. No one will ascend, because a throne will be taken away, and your crown has now been taken away. You forfeited that blessing because you abused and misused your positions as royals. That's correct. So I'm afraid, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, if you want to take me to court, I will fight you in the court, and you will lose, Your Majesty, and I will make sure of it. That you will not ascend to a throne, and you will none of your grandchildren will ascend to a throne, let alone wear the crown of the king. That's correct, because you're unworthy and you're unfit to occupy that throne, let alone to wear the crown. That's correct, because that is what Her Majesty Queen Victoria wants you to accept. She has taken away English monarch, so you don't have a monarch anymore. You'll have a monarch, but you'll exist as a commoner. So Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, you're going back to being a commoner, is what I'm saying. That's correct. I am taking away your crown and your throne for what happened here at this address, and for what happened in this country where this noble, that's correct, was targeted by your people, that's correct, and also by the people that you're in partnership with. It is your job, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, to make sure that, if there are other meek nobles or other royals in this country that have royal families, that we ought to be protected. Our rights are above the commoners' rights, and our rights are by far above the Maori king and his sons' rights, because we are part Scottish, part English, that's correct, and we are from a long line of, nobility, that's correct. So for that reason, the Crown of New Zealand, that's correct, will have to revoke the treaty partnership. That document must be revoked now. That's correct. That is the offering that was offered up on the holy altar. But that is the decision. Now, as for the other blessing that we had to accept, or the other offering the other sacrifice we had to offer on the holy altar, to appease not only the deceased, but also to appease this noble here, because after all, I'm the one who has been suffering. All by myself, that's correct. 8 years of torturing, of subjecting someone, especially a noble and a royal, one that is of royal blood, and nobility of the highest, that's correct, of the purest form, is very serious. You cannot do that to someone who is a noble. That's correct. You know that, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. If you're going to do that, then you're going to lose your throne or your crown. That is the convention. That is the convention of nobility. That's correct. I don't know, how can you not see that, Your Majesty? How can you not see that by torturing a noble like myself, to appease, to so-called satisfy and appease His Royal Highness the Maori King and His Royal Highness, or their royal family, that would commit treason, would it not? I'm not a commoner, Your Majesty. I'm a royal, that's correct. The Patu family knows very well. My mother's side, the royal blood, that's correct. And the royalty on my mother's side. And you also know that, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. But I think the problem is you've all undermined it. And you've mocked me as well, because I'm poor. That's correct. Only because, I'm not among the elite. And I don't engage any public engagements like you do, Your Majesty. That's correct. And I haven't been coronated like Your Majesty. Well, I'll tell you this, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. I do not need to be coronated. I automatically got my own coronation. That's great. That's right. Our family are so special. The brown monarch is so special that I don't need to wear to be coronated like your majesty. Nor wear a crown. My crown is invisible. So you can imagine now the audacity of them using you like some slave or some cargo or some chattel. That's correct. And undermining and looking down. And yet, let me remind you, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, that that's right, your beloved Prince Philip, that's correct. You know, he didn't have a good start. He wouldn't have had a privileged start. If it wasn't for the kindness, of some other important people, that's correct, to give him all the education, give him a good education. Give him a good start. That's right. Remember, his family were poor as well. There were times Prince Philip, I know it's really sad, was not from a wealthy, affluent family. That's correct. But he was orphaned out. He was orphaned out. He was almost like, he grew up as an orphan. That's correct. Poor, but thanks to the kindness of people that were there to help him. Otherwise, he would not have become your prince, Your Majesty. The kind of prince that we all want to marry. That's correct. Now, happiness is a very important thing in a royal life. That's correct. Now, what your people did here in New Zealand, and this includes the Crown as well, and also the people of Aotearoa, was that for the last 8 years and even the last 25 years, they've been denying my privileges, my full privileges as a full royal, and as a full citizen of New Zealand, and this included also my rallies for some odd reason. And all they did was take advantage of this noble, really. So what's the other blessing or the other sacrifice that I've made on the holy altar? That's part of this so-called, special announcement. Well, part of the agreement, the other sacrifice that I had to offer up on the holy altar was that His Royal Highness, the Maori King, Tuheitia Pōtautau Te Wherowhero, the seven, and his son would lose their crown and their throne. That's correct. Meaning they will convert back to being commoners. That's correct. So that means the Maori King's son is not going to ascend to a throne, and nor is he going to wear a crown. That's correct. So that's the blessing. So that is their blessing. That is the blessing from the gods. That is the blessing from the deceased, Her Royal Highness, Queen Victoria, and the Maori chiefs, nobles who signed that treaty document. Right, that's their blessing for the Maori King and his so-called son. That's correct. So the blessing for your royal family, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, that has been given by those who signed the treaty and agreement that made you the sovereign head of New Zealand, was also to take away your crown and your throne, and also to declare you as a commoner family. A commoner, without your crown and without your throne. In other words, you've lost those treasures because you were careless, and also because you were selfish, and also because of your arrogance, and you really did forget. That's correct. What it means to be a royal and what it means to be a true noble. And for that, the gods have taken away your blessings. You will see it. In future. What it feels like not to wear a crown. What it feels like to be on the ground instead of on a throne. And what it's like to be ignored by people and to have people give you the commonest treatment, just an ordinary treatment. That's great. That's great. Where there are no special treatments, special privileges. Where people will possibly disrespect you, Your Majesty, and possibly ignore Your Majesty, and will also say, well, I can't remember who she was. Well, I'd always know that, I don't know. I only know Dr. Snow Brown, and I only know Her Majesty Queen Snow Brown. That's correct. In the New World. So you can see now, Your Majesty, what has happened. You know that some royal families and that's great, have squandered their gifts and talents, but have abused their gifts and talents. And ideally, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, you should be placed under arrest. No, I'm serious. I'm very serious. And Her Majesty or Royal Highness, also the Maori King, is also guilty of treasons and should also be placed under arrest. The same for the Crown, the same for every member of the Crown that conspired with all of you to have me torture here at this address and to cover up these atrocities that's been going on in the last 8 years, going on 9 years at this address, that you are totally ignorant to it. I don't know why would you do that. You are gambling away. You know you're taking a big risk. But don't you dare use the excuse that I am sick, because this is exactly what some royal families that are jealous of other people's royal families and monarchs would do. Like your evil rallies, that's correct. They would go and through their so-called friends or criminal associates, that's correct, declare somebody, have somebody set up and brought in the courts. Normally, they don't do that to all the commoners, let alone the so-called criminals in this country. No, they don't. But for some odd reason, they have targeted you ever since they stole a copy of your play. But ever since that police officer violated you. I mean, it's so despicable how the English can stoop that low. It is so typical. How, they don't bother to come and knock on your door or to ask you for your permission. Instead, they will drug you and have sex with you against your will and and without consent and without knowledge either. To make you what? To try and convert you into something that you're not. And only because the noble wasn't interested in any of you. That's correct. But for you to go around behind my back and orchestrate things like that and set up to try and make me look like I'm some bad example or an evil person, it is so despicable, and it is also worthy of imprisonment for life. That's correct. So you better all what? You better all listen to what I'm saying, because why would I offer these sacrifices on the holy altar? On this day, on this momentous day, the 10th of March, 2022. Well, you all know I'm a noble. That's correct. I ascended to a throne and I wear a crown that's invisible. Hence the reason why I speak with authority. And even the Archbishop, and yet all they did was try to harm you and take advantage of, take things out of context inside my own kingdom. And they just didn't, and they were just totally ignorant. And all they did was enter and take advantage of your kingdom. But not a soul was ever bold enough to give you a donation. Well, how could they, if they were being threatened and intimidated not to do so on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II? Or on behalf of the Maori King and their people and their rights, that's great, let alone on behalf of the Crown. Especially those that are part of the treaty partnership, that's correct. You can understand now why I don't belong in this country. That I will be leaving your country. Now, the other sacrifice, that's correct, that it's going to be part of, well, it's already part of these blessings that have been given from the gods. And that is, you will all accept that you are all going to be taught lessons by the Nazi soldiers. This country is going to be taken over by the Nazi soldiers. And that will be my right as the sovereign head of New Zealand. Oh, let's say that again. You see, what happened is that when a treaty, that's correct, document, is revoked, it can only be done and it can only be done by a true noble and by a sovereign head. And because my sovereign head was born in this country and no other country, that's correct, I effectively became the new sovereign head of New Zealand, brackets Aotearoa, because of my kingdom. So if you reverse the treaty document, which is what Queen Victoria just did, and all the Maori nobles did that signed the treaty, effectively what they're saying is this country is no longer governed by, is no longer owned by the people of Aotearoa, nor is it owned by England anymore. That is what they're saying. So who actually owns New Zealand now, brackets Aotearoa? Well, if I'm the new sovereign head that was born in this country, then I must be the new owner of New Zealand, brackets Aotearoa. So what that means is that you ought to be taking directions from this headship, from this sovereign head, not from Queen Elizabeth II, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II anymore, because her position has been dissolved and revoked and forfeited by the gods and by the deceased. Because without the signature of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, the current so-called sovereign head, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, would not be the sovereign head of New Zealand. And they would not also, the crown wouldn't exist actually, and nor would any citizenship, and nor would the so-called the money that's in the crown's coffers would exist either. So there you go. I hope you're happy with that outcome, because I certainly am satisfied with that outcome. I know I'm worthy. I know I can be. I know I'm a sovereign head. I know how to be a sovereign head. But I will wait to go to the new world. That's correct. And then I say goodbye to all of you. Good luck. Because I'm taking all of your blessings. You don't deserve not one ounce. That's correct. And I'll leave nothing for you all. Just like you gave me nothing. But you controlled my life so much so for nothing. That's correct. And I could never understand why. And you took from me without nothing. That's correct. You stole also from this noble without any brains. And I'm afraid that this country doesn't deserve to have any. In fact, it doesn't need a sovereign head anymore, this country. Nor does it need any royals, like as in His Majesty, the Maori King and his son. That's correct. They don't need any royals in this country to run this country. In fact, your type of government should be just like the type of government of your next door neighbor, Australia. That's correct. Because your country doesn't know how to look after nor respect nobles. And I mean sovereign heads from other countries, and even when the sovereign head is born in your country, you still have no respect. And you can't tell the difference. That's correct. You know what I mean? So they don't need any royals or nobles. They don't need sovereign heads either. All they need is a body that, a crown, a body that stands for the government of New Zealand. An ordinary flag that's just a communist flag. That's correct, because after all, this is a communist nation. A ratbag nation, a convict nation. That's correct. A criminal nation where the criminals seem to be more respected and run this country, and they seem to know how to run this country, or they already do run this country and the system. That's correct. than the nobles themselves who know better. And they said they seem to sit on the nobles' heads. That's correct. They walk all over the nobles' heads, even the sovereign heads. They really have no respect whatsoever, and for that they deserve the death penalty by the Nazi soldiers, but they also deserve to be taught lessons by them. I don't think New Zealand, you would break like a twig. If they fired 400, if President Vladimir Putin fired 400 ballistic missiles to this country, you wouldn't be able to handle that kind of pressure. Like the Ukrainians, that's correct. No, you wouldn't. Because you've never experienced anything like that. That's correct. You don't have the X factor. You couldn't even sacrifice your treaty document. And you couldn't even sacrifice a donation for this noble here. That's correct. But I mean, I'm part of your country. I've been here 39 years. My intellectual property was born in your country. My kingdom was born here. But you couldn't sacrifice not $1, not even 10 cents. That's correct. What kind of spirit is that? And what kind of mindset is that? But what kind of... I don't know, arrogance. I don't know what you would call that. Is it ignorance or arrogance? Or is it that I can't be bothered attitude? No, you definitely don't deserve any kings or queens in this country. Nor any royal monarchs. They don't need any royal monarchs. That's the whole idea. They only know how to harm nobles and royals, but they don't know how to respect them and how to treat them and how to protect them. They'd rather protect the so-called criminals and respect the criminals more than the royals themselves, let alone a sovereign head or a noble like you who's meek. That's correct. I really don't care. That's right. Now they're going to have to accept those blessings have come from above. And there's not much I can do. No, there's nothing I can do. Everyone is for himself now. But like I said, the arrest better be made. That's correct. But you all need to stop taking advantage of this noble. What were you thinking? That I was still going to, be your so-called playmate? Your so-called, chattel or cargo that you can just pick on, or somebody that you can just pick on whenever you want to? And dump whatever you want to feel like dumping on? Well, that's really nice. Well, now you know why I speak the manner that I do and why my kingdom exists is because I am actually the sovereign head of New Zealand. Brackets, Aotearoa, or is it like on my logo, Aotearoa New Zealand? I am actually the sovereign head of this country, the new sovereign head. So that the new owner of your country. Isn't that lovely? Yes, but my benefit rate is so damn low. Yeah, so is everything else. They are so stingy and such Scrooges. That's correct. They got no respect. None whatsoever. So for that reason, you ought to beat the crap out of them, but you ought to teach the fuck out of them. That's correct. Because that's exactly what they need, a good beating on the back. Knock some sense into them. But I mean, they must all be tails. But they must be sick with incest. I'm afraid they are sex addicts and they are sick for neurotomania. And they don't deserve your sovereign head, let alone your meek brown monarch. No, definitely not. Hell no. Not after what they gave you. That's correct. Well, at least they now know what's going to happen. So, Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II, if you want to take me to court, Your Majesty, I'd be happy to, quite happy to, because I will fight for your throne, that's correct, and your crown. That is correct. In fact, I'm more worthy. I've got more rights to your crown and your throne, Your Majesty, because I'm the sovereign head of this country. So that means I have authority over England. That's correct. If I'm the so-called new sovereign head of New Zealand because of the treaty document. That's correct. But also because of my English and Scottish heritage. So, Your Majesty, That's correct. You don't have a throne anymore, nor a crown. And I suggest that everyone in England do not give Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II any more royal treatments or any special treatments. Give her the treatment of a commoner. That's correct. Because that's exactly the kind of royal monarch, the kind of sovereign head that she is. What she did to you here in New Zealand, that's correct. Through her people and through also the people of Aotearoa. That's correct. They have a bad habit in this country of converting, trying to convert, nobles like yourself. That's correct. And people with high status to criminals or to what? Or to nobodies. That's correct. Trying to strip their so-called titles. That's right. Strip their so-called statuses. That's correct. Take away that and give it the so-called, and brand them as convicts or brand them as, demented people or deranged or insane. That's correct. Judicially or illegally. But that's all jealousy. That all is pure jealousy, I know. There was no need for them to target you. There was a lot of other citizens that they could have targeted. That's correct, all these years. But they just seemed to somehow just couldn't leave you alone. Now, what are they doing here at this address, eh? This is a nice setup, all right? How can a commoner who has no title, has no status of any sort, who is nothing more than a gang basher, a criminal, that's correct, a nomad, a nobody, a void, dictate to a sovereign head like such as myself, let alone my royal family? Do you know how serious that is? My family should not be dictated to by someone of that class. Because it would never happen if I was living in Germany, because that kind of person would be put to death. That's correct. And Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II knows very well that if that ever happened to her in England or any of her family members, they would also be put to death. That's correct. As the convention is for nobles. Now, there you go. My dear mother, has nothing to do with my sovereign head. Now, as for the Patu family, I want to let you all know, you have nothing to do with my brown monarch. Just remember that. Because I was born a Trevorana, so you don't have any rights over me either. That's correct. And I actually don't trust the Patu, to be honest, despite that their mum's side, of course, but I actually don't trust some of them. Because I remember a while back, that's correct, we got invited to a Sunday lunch. That's correct. Now, we hadn't eaten, of course. I was starving that Sunday. That's correct. So I was so looking forward to, they call it tonight. That's correct. Well, we got there early in the morning, not morning, but around about sort of 11, 12ish. That's correct. But we were made to wait for almost 3 hours. That's correct. 3 to 4 hours. Before they finally decided to have, that's correct, to have the tōnai or the lunch. Now, by then I said to myself, man, I've been starving. Now I've lost my appetite. That's correct. And I suddenly dawned on me, there must have been a reason why they waited that long to have the tōnai, to have the Sunday lunch. And I suddenly realized, it dawned on me when we left my so-called, my mother's so-called cousins, their relations, address that Sunday, that they applied a harmful protocol from an evil organization. That's correct. I said to myself, it almost felt like somebody had actually dictated to that family, that they actually told them to have the lunch around about, say, after close to about 5 or 4 in the afternoon. It was near at 5, that's correct. It was about that time, that's correct. They suddenly decided to have lunch. But I said to myself, I can't seem to, but I get the hunch, I get this feeling that they did get dictated to by a red and white demon. Because they knew that, I'd said something here inside this address, and they knew, of course, that I hadn't eaten. That's correct. So in other words, that was actually torture. So that's why I don't trust anybody in New Zealand, not my mother's side of the family and not even my dad's side of the family, because it seems like everywhere you go, there appears to be some sort of arbitrary dictatorships to your privileges. Can you imagine that? The conspiracy? Who the hell is this person that's dictating to my privileges, which is absolutely rude and disgusting? That's why I will never have anything to do with the Patu family. Thank you, but there's no way I would go there. I'm a Brown. And I'm looking forward to going to America and cutting all ties, both sides of my mom's side family, my dad's and my mom's side of the family, because I do not trust any of them. That's correct. Because of the red and white demons. That's correct. And also because of the conspiracy where you are being harmed and targeted for some odd reason by the same people, by the same so-called betrayers, traitors, who do nothing but commit treasons against myself and my private monarch. And Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth, Queen Snow Brown is no longer in agreement with any of you. That's correct. Well, I believe I've said enough. I've said enough, Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. As for that lawyer, right, he is nothing more than just a commoner. Like I said, this country is a commoner country, it's a ratbag nation. Doesn't deserve a sovereign head, nor does it need another monarch or a crown. No. You people need to go back to start from square one, down at the bottom, from the basics. That's correct. Because you don't know how to run your country. If you did, you wouldn't harm this noble, but you wouldn't steal from this noble, and you wouldn't listen into my private conversations as well. I'm talking about the elite who are taking full advantage of my so-called tenancy at this location among these so-called, ratbags or criminals. By listening into your so-called private conversations. The only reason why the elite want to gain access to you, just like how their people want to gain access to you, is because they know you are more privileged and you are above every one of them. That's correct. So that I must be some very important person. That's correct. For them to take those kinds of measures and want to constantly want to be sort of, either doing something against you, constantly challenging you. That's correct. They certainly have some sort of addiction of some sort, erotomania. They should all be drugged. If I was the judge and I gave you all, especially all those who committed treasons, put all your names on the order of supervision and then give you the same medicine that you gave me. That's correct. Undergo cognitive behavioral therapy and be drugged for over 7 years, for the rest of your days. That's correct. Because they were cruel, the most cruel people I've ever come across. They were not human at all, to be honest. That's why, and I actually think they tortured their children. They must have been tortured when they were young. That's correct. That as they grew up, they decided to emulate the same sort of attitudes towards their children, towards other people as well. Except Mr. Willow, Mr. Anthony Shaw, you need to grow up. He needs to grow up. That's correct. He needs to grow up and needs to stop using you, accessing you. He doesn't need to listen to any of your so-called private conversations, nor does he need to dictate to your privilege either. He ain't my husband. He's nothing more than just a lunatic and a maniac. That's correct. And a commoner as well, who should know his boundaries. That's correct. I had already made it very clear. That's correct. So if I were you all, I'd stop using other people for you to get ahead. If you want to use somebody, use your own family members or use your own people to get ahead. But don't use this noble anymore, please. Thank you. I've had enough. I've had enough. And I certainly don't need to be used by anybody so that they can get ahead. If you want to stomp on somebody's head, stomp on your own people's head. You want to study somebody, study your own people. You want to torture somebody, you torture your own people. That's correct. But don't go targeting people such this noble sovereign head. That's great. Because that's not your level and that's not your class. And people that have manners and have class, they do not target sovereign heads nor nobles like myself, because that is just desperation. Begging for attention. That's correct. Right, you all have a nice morning now. I know I'm going to have a nice morning today. Knowing that I have sealed, knowing that I've reversed and made these offerings upon the holy altar. And it's justified. Besides, after all, if I were Queen Elizabeth II, I would think about what I've just been saying. That's correct, carefully. Because the future is going to be slim. The future is going to be it's going to be cut short, Your Majesty. That's correct. So if I were you, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, I would ask myself, in order to protect, in order to prevent, that's correct, losing your monarch and also, having no monarch in your country, where 400 missiles could come your way from President Vladimir Putin, you must protect my monarch by allowing me to put to death all those. And that's another sacrifice. That is the other offering that was made on the holy altar. That those who committed treasons against my person, especially here in New Zealand, would be put to death. It's time for you to go. It's time for you to go. You have to make a sacrifice. That's a sacrifice. But you see, it's a justified sacrifice. You should have gone into jail a long time. You should have been put to death a long time ago. That's correct. But of course, it had to be this noble. That's correct, that you had to cross. But you see, you're not going to stop the commission of your treasons. That's the problem. And you're not going to stop your offending that amount to torture and slavery and cruelties, and also in home invasions and unlawful entries and drugging and so forth. So as far as I'm concerned, you need that bullet. You need the death penalty now to put you out of your misery, but also to stop you. Because no rehabilitation, locking you up in jailbird isn't going to solve the problem. That's correct. And quarantine, not likely to reform you, not likely to change your attitude, and also you're not likely to ever stop what you're doing, especially to myself and my royal monarch. I've got a royal monarch. For that reason, you deserve the death penalty. Time to go. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.